All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Kevan McClelland. I'm a PhD candidate at UNC Chapel Hill. I'm going to be talking today about the Bluecurls of Florida. This is the genus Trichostema. I have a lovely little subtitle here for those who are familiar with Harry Potter, the Florida Bluecurls and where to find them. So a little bit of background about me. I am a PhD candidate in Alan Weekly's lab at UNC Chapel Hill. And my PhD is about multiple aspects of the genus Trichostema. I just finished my 5th year of graduate school, and hopefully I will be done and graduating and publishing my research within the next year or so, fingers crossed. So what I'm going to be talking about today is a little bit of background about the genus Trichostema in general, and then I'm going to transition to things to keep in mind when trying to identify Trichostema in Florida. And then I will go through each of the species or entities of Trichostema that I have identified in Florida, talking about each of them individually, how do you identify them, and also good places to see each of these entities. So a little bit of background about the genus. There are currently 19 named species that are split into 5 sections. Most of the species in Trichostema are western or southwestern. And here along the bottom, I have kind of a representative sample from each of the sections of the genus. So on the far left, this is woolly Bluecurls, or Trichostema lanatum. It grows in the chaparral in Southern California, and it is super, super pink and fuzzy on the flowering stalks. Really, really cool. Section peniculatum is in the desert Southwest. It occurs in the Madrean Sky Islands, the Madrean Archipelago down there. And this species here is Trichostema arizonicum, or Arizona Bluecurls. You could probably guess where it grows. It's primarily in Arizona. The third section that I have listed here is kind of an oddball, because while it is a Bluecurl, it's not blue and it's not particularly curly. And that's because it's evolved for hummingbird pollination. So Section rhodanthum is restricted to the states in Mexico of Oaxaca and Puebla, and it grows on the volcanic mountainsides in that area of Mexico, and it is pollinated by hummingbirds, hence why it is kind of that pinkish rosy color as opposed to a blue. Our 4th section is Section orthopodium. Trichostema lanceolatum, or vinegar weed, is a representative of that. Again, these are all kind of weedy annuals that grow out in California and in large portions of the West Coast, from Washington all the way down to Baja California. And then our last section is Section Trichostema, represented here by our lovely Bluecurls, Trichostema dichotomum. This is the section that occurs here in the eastern United States. So, Section Trichostema currently has 4 named species, and I'm currently working on this section as the primary part of my PhD. My advisor and I actually named a new species of Trichostema in this section in 2019. It's called Trichostema nesophyllum, or dune or Carolina Bluecurls. And it is an endemic to the barrier islands of North and South Carolina. And a picture here of its very pale, kind of lavender white flowers that are fairly diagnostic of this species. The other 2 species in this section are Trichostema setaceum, which is the narrow-leaf Bluecurls, and Trichostema subretessence, which is the Florida scrub Bluecurls. Section Trichostema as a section is very, very widespread in the eastern United States. As you can see, it ranges all the way from South Central Texas to the Maritimes up in Canada. and everywhere in between. The majority of this range is Trichostema dichotomum and a little bit Trichostema setaceum. All of the Florida stuff, like Subretessence and things that are related to Subretessence, are entirely restricted to the Florida Peninsula and occasionally eke out into Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi. If we zoom in specifically on Florida, you'll see that this section is very widespread in Florida. In fact, it occurs in every single county in the state as a section. Each species has kind of its own specific range that will go into a little bit more depth when I talk about each of the individual species and entities. So some of the ecology of Bluecurls, they are a nectar source for a variety of insects. I see butterflies, hoverflies, small bees. I've even seen ants using the flowers for nectar. But pollination in this section is solely by bees. And so we shall watch a little bumblebee pollinating Trichostema dichotomum. This is at Carl Duval Moore State Park in Interlochen, Florida. The bumblebee is here in the middle of our screen in the red circle, and we shall play. The cool thing about the pollination here is that you see when it lands on a flower, the flower kind of falls or bends over, and that actually brushes the stamens on the back of the bee and deposits pollen on the back of the bee, so that when it visits the next flower, that pollen is there to be picked up by the stigma of the next flower. Very efficient pollination syndrome. So 3 named species in Florida currently: Trichostema dichotomum, which is Bluecurls or forked Bluecurls; Trichostema setaceum, which is our narrowleaf Bluecurls; and Trichostema subretessens, which is the Florida scrub Bluecurls. A large part of my thesis is about determining the number of species or subspecies or varieties or ecologically significant units, if you will, of Bluecurls that are present in Florida and adjacent states. This in turn is hopefully going to help me understand evolutionary patterns in this genus and be able to compare the evolutionary patterns in Trichostema to other similarly distributed organisms in Florida. So far, based on a lot of morphological work and a very small amount of genetic work, I have identified 5 what I'm calling entities other than the 3 species listed above. These entities could possibly be species, could possibly be subspecies, varieties. I don't really know yet. Hopefully, when I finish all of my genetic work, I'll have a little bit better understanding of how all of these things are related to each other and whether or not they deserve species status. So far, the morphology seems pretty strong for a lot of them to recognize them at a species rank. But in this presentation, since all this is preliminary, their names are going to be in quotes. And they don't actually have any species name yet because it's not officially published. So almost time for our lineup. But first, some things to keep in mind when trying to identify a Trichostema in Florida. First, you need to know where you are geographically. So Panhandle versus Peninsula, are you on one of the ridges? Because some of them occur only in the northern part of Florida and in the Panhandle. Some of them only occur in the southern part of the peninsula. Some of them occur only on certain ridges in Florida. You also need to keep in mind the habitat that you're in. Is it wet, like a hammock, or is it dry, or is it very dry? So are you in scrub? Because different entities occur in different environments. You also can try and determine whether or not the plant is perennial versus annual. Sometimes this is hard to do in the summer when everything is green and growing, but in the late fall, all of the annuals will die off, whereas our perennial plants, they'll only die back. a lot of times they will still keep leaves towards the base of the plant or even throughout the plant, and will send out new branches in the early spring to grow new flowers. Another thing that you can look for in determining whether or not your plant is perennial is, does it have what's called an inflorescence skeleton? So in these plants, in the perennial ones, after the plant flowers, a lot of times that flowering branch will die, but it will stay on the plant. And so as you're looking at these plants, you might find some that have lots of new branches or lots of even new flowers, and you'll find these dried up, dead branches with previous year's flowering branches on them. So that is a good indication that what you're looking at is a perennial. Due to the fact that Florida is very warm, this gets a little tricky with Trichostema dichotomum, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later. Another thing to keep in mind is how branched is the plant. Depending on what group you're looking at, it either kind of branches at the bottom or branches throughout the plant or near the top of the plant. Stem hairs are also important. They're kind of hard to see, but once you kind of get the feel of them, they're pretty good at determining what at least group you're looking at. So the big difference are the short curved hairs, or are they long spreading hairs? And I'll talk a little bit more about that and include pictures when we get to our lineup. Leaf size and shape is also pretty helpful. Time of year for flowering, somewhat helpful, but again, there's a lot of overlap. And then there are some fruit characteristics that are small, but also pretty helpful in determining what group of Trichostema you're looking at. And you've heard me talking about our groups, and these are our three general groups. So the first group is Trichostema dichotomum sensu stricto, or in the strict sense. So things that are Trichostema dichotomum and fit the description of Trichostema dichotomum. And all of the related entities that, based on my morphological work, seem most closely related to Trichostema dichotomum. The second group is Trichostema setaceum, all by its lonesome. It's very, very enigmatic species, even though it's kind of small and depauperate occasionally, but it's cute. And then the third group is Trichostema subretessence sensu stricto, again, in the strict sense. So we're just talking about the true species subretessence, and then the things that I have through morphology determined to be related to subretessence. We will begin our dive in the Trichostema dichotomum group. This group is located throughout Florida. It's the most widespread of all of the three groups. They prefer to live in wet to dry environments. They do not occur in scrub. They tend to avoid really dry, scrubby environments, but you will find them in sandhill or even in coastal strand vegetation. This group includes both annual and perennial entities. It branches either at the top, middle, or throughout the plant. So it is not going to branch just from the bottom, as in our subretessence entities. The stems also have these long spreading hairs, especially at the nodes. This is very different from the other groups of Trichostema, which only have short, down curved, or very short spreading hairs. Leaves are typically larger and wider than in other groups, and they're widest towards the base. So we call that ovate or lanceolate. So you can kind of think it as an egg shape sort of leaf. The different entities flower at different times. One of the entities, Trichostema floridanum, basically flowers year-round. Fruits are typically larger and not as rich as the other groups. So these have the largest fruits of the three groups that we're talking about today. And the first species that we'll look at specifically is Dichotomum sensu stricto. So this species is limited to the and in central Florida and throughout the eastern United States broadly. It lives in wet to dry environments. It's really a generalist. I have found it in sand, over clay. I've seen it observed on rock outcrops and in glades. As long as it's got enough space to kind of spread out and get enough sun, it's happy. It's a weedy annual. Every year it will die back. It branches typically in the mid to top part of the plant, but really robust individuals can get somewhat bushy. And the stems have these characteristic long spreading hairs, especially at the nodes. Even the other members of the Dichotomum group typically do not have long spreading hairs on the main portion of their stem. And this really sets Dichotomum apart from all of the other species in this group and in this section generally. Leaves are medium to large compared to the other members of this group. And it typically flowers in the fall, starting usually late July, early August, and through October. There's an asterisk on July because in the southernmost populations, I've actually observed where if the area has a mild winter, which is becoming more common, the plants, the seeds will actually germinate in the winter, and the plant will get large enough to where the day length in the spring will be similar to the day length in the fall and will actually flower in the spring, survive over the fall, and flower again once the days start getting shorter on the other side of the summer. So this can really confuse the issue when you're in the southern part of the range of this species. This species also has the largest fruits of this section of the genus, and they are moderately ridged. And I'll point out what I mean by ridging in a second. So here's our lovely range map. It kind of cuts off about the middle part of the peninsula. Where exactly to draw that line is really fuzzy because another one of the members of this group is somewhat hard to differentiate from Dichotomum from just by naturalist observations, which is in large part what I'm going off of to help build these maps. And so picture time. So here on the left, we can see the characteristic long spreading hairs of Dichotomum. So they're really, really long. It looks like almost thorns or something coming off, but they're just regular old hairs that you can see if you, with your naked eye, if you hold the plant pretty close to your face. Here we have a young individual, and we see it's starting to extend branches in the upper part of the plant, and a lovely shot of some flowers at Ralph E. Simmons State Forest. The flowers are typically on the lighter side and tend to be more of this kind of blue-violet color than some of the other entities. In the top right, we have some of the fruits. And here, this white bar is 1 millimeter. So these fruits are very, very tiny. But here in profile, you can see how this outline forms these ridges. And this ridge patterning is helpful in determining what group you're looking at of Trichostema. Good places to see Dichotomum sensu-stricto in Florida. Citrus Wildlife Management Area of Withlacoochee State Forest there's just gobs of it all over the place. It really likes it there. Ralph E. Simmons State Forest, if you're familiar with that state forest, it's in the along the trail in the power line right-of-way as you're reaching the river. Last time I went, there were thousands, possibly tens of thousands of this plant in that area, just ridiculous numbers. The Marjorie Harris Carr Cross Florida Greenway also has several populations along that area in some of the most southern populations that I'm aware of good Dichotomum sensu-stricto. That's also where I found one of our weird plants that had a spring flowering and was flowering again in the fall. And last one, Bailey Mine Tract of Goethe State Forest also has really good population of Dichotomum. All right. Entity number 2, Trichostema floridanum. If you are familiar with Alan Weekly's Flora of the Southeastern United States, you are probably familiar with floridanum if you've tried to use it to key a trichostema. This entity is located throughout Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, and one population in Georgia, but it's strictly coastal or near coastal, and typically with a calcareous influence. So think shell, lots and lots of shell. And it lives in these drier environments. So it is restricted mainly to coastal strand and back dune areas along the coast where there's lots of shell, but also it's really sandy. So a lot of the water just goes straight on through and not a lot of water is retained in the soil. This entity is perennial and it branches throughout the plant and kind of makes these cute little short, compact bushes. The stems have short down-curved hairs, but has longer spreading hairs at the nodes. But the hairs never get as long as in Dichotomum sensistrictum. It has smaller leaves when compared with other entities of this group. It also will have leaves that are widest towards the tip as opposed towards the base. And that has actually led several of these populations to be identified as Subretessence in the past. But the hairs and the fruits really set this apart and ally it more with Dichotomum than with Subretessence. It flowers kind of whenever it wants. I have been growing this in the greenhouse for 3 or 4 years, and I don't know what stimulates it to flower. It just kind of flowers when it feels like it. And we see that in the wild too. It'll grow in the middle of summer. I've seen things on iNaturalist that were flowering in like December or January. I don't know how it determines when to flower. It just does. And the flowers are typically darker than Trichostema dichotomum. And the fruits are kind of medium-sized, but they're much smoother than the other entities. Unfortunately, I do not have a picture of the fruits to demonstrate this, but I hopefully will in the future. So here's our lovely range map. Notice very coastally restricted. There's also a population in the Bahamas that I unfortunately have not had the chance to go and check out, because every person's dream to do field work in the Bahamas. But you'll notice that there's kind of a big gap between the Tampa area and Pinellas County and the Panhandle. And this separation is also represented in some of the morphology and ecology of this entity. And it's weird. I don't fully understand it. It's possible that it might be a separate thing, but right now I'm considering it as part of floridanum. So more pictures. So again, our flowers are a little bit darker than in Dichotomum. And here we can see kind of that bushy architecture of the plant. Here we have the very short stem hairs as opposed to those really long ones that we saw in Dichotomum. And it really likes these openings in coastal strand, and you can see the shell all mixed in here with the sand. And that is really characteristic of where it likes to grow. On the top right is a particularly robust individual. So I'm 6'1", and that's my knee, and it's above my knee. So this plant was probably about 3 feet tall, I think. And so that's one of the larger individuals that I've seen. Usually they form kind of these shorter, shrubbier bushes. Good places to see this entity. Anywhere there's enough shelly open space near the beach, really. Fort Clinch State Park has a really, really big population. Gamble Rogers Memorial, Sebastian Inlet, Fort Pierce, Bill Baggs, Cape Florida State Park. It's all over Sanibel Island, all over Cayo Costa and Don Pedro Honeymoon Island State Park. All of those just gobs and gobs of this entity. This last park, Fred Gannon Rocky Bayou State Park, actually has a really big population of the weird panhandle floridanum thing. And it is all through the campsite there, and also goes kind of down the hill to where the creek runs through the park. Our last dichotomum-related entity is our big and bushy Bluecurls. It is located in the western part of North Peninsular Florida, and it lives in wetter environments, so hammocks of various flavors. No calcareous influence necessary. It likes it wet. And the thing here is it's a perennial, again, branches throughout most of the plant, but it's much, much larger than floridanum, with the bushes easily getting up to 1.5 meters tall. Very, very large. The stems, again, have shorter hairs than dichotomum, but there's a lot of variation in this trait, in this entity, that I don't really fully understand yet. And hopefully the genetic side of things will help clear this up, crossing fingers, but not necessarily holding my breath. The leaves are very large. So this has the largest leaves of this section. It flowers in the fall, and the flowers are also larger than other species. So it's got really big leaves, really big flowers, really big bush. So it's kind of a dichotomum on steroids, if you will. The fruits, however, are more similar to floridanum. So this is the estimated range based on ecological conditions. I have not found it in every part of this range, but again, it's kind of this weird thing that kind of floats around. And again, I don't really fully understand it. The two pockets here around Gainesville and then the Fairfield Hills, those are kind of a little bit different than the more widespread thing to the south. And it, again, might be a different flavor. I don't know. Hopefully the genes will tell us a little bit of information about that. Picture time. So on the left, we have our nice short, in this case, they're spreading hairs as opposed to our down curved hairs. But again, they are much, much shorter than in dichotomum. Here we have a very robust yearling. So here we can already see that it's branching even at the bottom of the plant, unlike in that dichotomum that we saw where it was only really branching towards the top. This very large individual here was planted at the Gamble Rogers Park in their pollinator garden. And it very, very large. Again, my leg is here for scale. And the flower here is like 2 centimeters, maybe not huge, but most Trichostema flowers in this section are 1 to 1.5 centimeters, whereas this is 2 centimeters and sometimes even larger than that. So the flowers are much larger than the other entities in this group. Good places to see big and bushy is Colt Creek State Park, Mockernut Hill Botanical Garden, San Falasco Hammock Preserve, and Devil's Mill Hopper. It's also planted in a wide variety of places in pollinator and native gardens as Trichostema dichotomum. I think this is the one that made it into the nursery that supplies a lot of native gardening supplies. It's a perennial, and it is ecologically somewhat different than dichotomum sensu stricto. But again, hopefully my research will help me and the rest of y'all understand it a little bit better in the near future. Transitioning now to our second group, Trichostema setaceum, all by its little lonesome. It's located in northern Florida and throughout the east. It lives in dry environments. In Florida, it's typically restricted to sandhills. It's an annual, and if it branches, it's usually in the mid to top part of the plant. It's usually not a very big plant. The stems have these really tiny, short, down-curved hairs, and the leaves are characteristically long and very thin. It flowers in the fall, August through October, and the fruit size is intermediate between dichotomum and subretessence, and also with kind of an intermediate amount of ridging. So here is our lovely range map, again, restricted primarily to the northern part of Florida. in Florida. And some lovely pictures. On the left here, we can see the very characteristic long, very, very thin leaves of this species. Here, this is one of the most robust individuals that I have ever seen. It's got like 4 branches coming off of it, which is ridiculous for this species. On the right, we can see these really, really tiny hairs. They look like just white pinpricks all along the stem. And that really sets it apart from the Dichotomum entities, which have much longer hairs. And of course, the obligatory flower picture, lovely shade of blue. The flowers are typically about the same colors as Dichotomum, a little bit darker occasionally. Good places to see Trichostema setaceum, Citrus Wildlife Management Area of Withlacoochee State Forest, Mike Rose Bulkhead Branch State Park, Lake Talquin State Park and State Forest, and Torreya State Park. All of those are great places to see this species. Our third and final group is the Trichostema subretessence and related entities group. These are all restricted to peninsular Florida and are mostly restricted to the major ridge systems. It lives in dry to very dry environments. So typically flatwoods, sandhills, scrub. All of these entities are perennial, and they all typically branch towards the bottom of the plant. The stems have tiny, short, down-curved hairs, very similar to setaceum, with one exception. The leaves are variable, but on the whole, they're usually much shorter than the other groups, and they typically are widest towards the tip, so obovate, or upside down egg-shaped. It flowers late summer through the winter. Again, the asterisk here is that since they are perennial, something will sometimes trigger them to have a very small bloom period in the early spring. The flowers are typically much, much darker than our other entities that we've talked about, and the buds are almost black because they are just so dark. The fruits are smaller than the other groups, and the ridges are relatively larger. And I actually have a couple seed pictures to demonstrate that for these. Our first species is Subretessence sensu stricto. So this is the type species of this group, and it occurs on the main ridge systems along central peninsular Florida. So it occurs on the Trail, Mount Dora, Lake Wales, and Bombing Range ridges. The Bombing Range ridge I put an asterisk next to because, again, kind of like the floridanum, where it has a little bit of a difference than the rest of Subretessence, and I'm investigating that further to see what's kind of going on there. But right now, including it with Subretessence. It lives in dry to very dry environments, scrub or scrub sandhill margins. The branching and stem hairs are typical of the group, so towards the base of the plant, really short down-curved hairs. Leaves are short and round, and it flowers August through November, typical fruits of this group. Here's its range, our lovely central ridge system of Florida, with the Bombing Range also highlighted here. Wonderful, wonderful plant. I really like the Subretessence entities because of how dark and rich the blue is, or the blue violet is, of their flowers. So here in the middle, we have our stem shot where we actually see the kind of small, rounder leaf and the really, really short, again, kind of white pinprick sorts of hairs on the stem. On the right here, this really shows the branching pattern of this species very well, where all of these flowering stalks are originating from a very small kind of trunk at the base. And here at Mike Rose Bulkhead Branch State Park, lots and lots of Trichostema subretessens on this sandhill to scrub margin. Here at the bottom, we have the seeds, or the fruits. the white bar is 1 millimeter. So these are getting just above 1 millimeter in length. So a lot shorter relatively than Trichostema, Dichotomum, and related entities. Good places to see this species are Micros, Cold Head Branch State Park, Ocala National Forest, Alan David Broussard Catfish Creek State Park, Highlands Hammock State Park, and Archbold Biological Station. Our next entity is the Pine Flatwoods entity. This is located in central and southern peninsular Florida, and it is actually restricted to off of the main ridges. It does not occur on the main central ridges of Florida. It lives in somewhat wet to very dry environments, so mesic to scrubby flatwoods. Basically, it just needs enough fire to kind of maintain an open environment for it to really do well. The branching and stem hairs are typical of the Subretessence group, but the leaves are kind of long and thin compared to the other Subretessence entities. And this has actually had led me to identify this originally as kind of a Trichostema setaceum thing. And that's how I've been identifying them on iNaturalist. But my recent morphological work has actually pushed it in with the Subretessence group. It flowers very late in the year, October through December, and its fruits are the largest of the Subretessence entities with the biggest ridges. So this is the approximate range map, coast to coast, but staying off of that central ridge system. Here we can see kind of the variation in leaf morphology. So on the left, this is very typical of the eastern populations of this plant, very narrow leaves. And that's what led me, again, to think that this might be a setaceum thing. But on the west side of the ridge, the leaves are a little bit wider, as we see here in this plant. We've got our really small, short pinprick hairs, again, on our stems, lovely dark blue flowers. And here in the bottom right, we can really see kind of the ridging and pitting on these fruits. That is very diagnostic of the Subretessence group. The top right, this is Jonathan Dickinson State Park, part of their scrubby flatwoods, where I found lots and lots of this plant. Good places to see this entity are at Split Oak Forest, Wildlife and Environmental Area. I've just gotten barraged with observations of this thing from there. And what's really exciting about that population is that it's large enough that the recessive pink flowered form actually occurs in that population. Really, really cool. St. Sebastian Rivers Preserve State Park also has a good population. Jonathan Dickinson State Park, Little Manatee River State Park, Lake Manatee State Park, Wingate Creek State Park. All of those are great places to see this entity. Our third entity is the Brooksville Ridge Trichostema. And you can probably guess by the name that I've given it, it only occurs on the Brooksville Ridge and adjacent scrublands. It lives in dry to very dry environments, so kind of the inverse of Subretessence sensu stricto. This actually prefers sandhill and sandhill scrub margins as opposed to pure scrub. The branching is very typical of this group. Stems are, the hairs on the stems, however, are different. They're all spreading as opposed to curled. So I have a good picture of that. The leaves are very short and thin, and it flowers also a little bit later in the year, October and November. The fruits are typical of this group. Here's its range, our lovely Brooksville Ridge there, and some of the scrublands to the west in, I believe that's Citrus, down into, I think, Hernando County. Here we go. Our lovely habit shot here on the top right. Notice how all of these really long branches are all coming out of the base of this plant. This is very, very typical of the Subretessence group, Trichostema. Here you can really see that these leaves are kind of small and thin, and they actually kind of fold up on themselves. We've got the really dark blue-violet flowers that are typical of the Subretessence group. But down here in the bottom right, we can see all of these hairs on the side of the stem. They're all spreading, which is very, very different from the other Subretessence entities, which all have those down curved hairs. And a wonderful habitat shot here in Citrus Wildlife Management Area of Withlacoochee State Forest. If I do end up naming this as a species or subspecies, this is actually the type locality. So this is where the plant came from that I'm actually going to describe the species or subspecies. Good places to see the Brooksville Ridge entity are in Citrus Wildlife Management Area of Withlacoochee State Forest. That one by far has the largest populations of this plant. There's also a pretty good sized population at the Bailey Mine Tract of Goat State Forest. Our final entity today is the Hobe Mountain Bluecurls. It's located only along the Jupiter Ridge in Martin County, Florida, and it only occurs in scrub. Unlike the other Subretessence entities, it actually branches throughout the plant. So it forms these short bushes, very similar to floridanum. The stem hairs are typical of the group. Leaves are similar to Subretessence and Zustricto. Again, this is a really late flowerer, late October through December. And the fruits are actually the smallest of this section. So very, very small fruits. And so here's our range map. And no, this is not a blank map. Its range is right there. And so we'll zoom in on southern Florida, and you can see it a little bit better. And so we'll zoom in on Martin County, and there it is. That is the only place in the world where this thing occurs. We'll zoom in even further to get kind of an up close look. So we've got Hobe Sound, Port Salerno, Stuart, Florida, Jupiter, Florida. This is its potential historic range. Its current range, and the only areas in this part of Florida that have appropriate habitat are here. So greatly reduced habitat availability, lots of fragmentation going on. Luckily, the places where it does occur have very large populations. So even though it is very restricted, it seems to have a very high number of plants, even in this very restricted range. This is by far my favorite of the Floridian Bluecurls, primarily because of how wonderful they are when they are in flower. They form these bushes, and the contrast of these really vivid blue-violet flowers with the rest of the plant, I just think is really striking. And they sometimes even get little spots on the upper part of the flower as opposed to just the white part of the flower, which is really, really cool. These things, when they are in full force, are wonderful to view. Here in the middle, we have the typical short hairs on the stem of the Subretessence group. Bottom right, we have a view of the scrub at Jonathan Dickinson State Park. And in the top right, I actually got into the middle of this bush and took a picture of the base of the plant just to visualize how branched this thing is all over the place, just branches on branches on branches that form this beautiful little hemispheric shrub. Again, my favorite of the Floridian entities. Good places to see the Hobe Mountain Bluecurls are Jonathan Dickinson State Park around Hobe Mountain, Sea Branch Preserve State Park, Hobe Sound National Wildlife Refuge, and those three parks are the only places that I've actually found this thing growing. So very, very limited range. Luckily, it seems that where it occurs is already protected. So, you know, a positive. In summary, I have created kind of a bird watching list, except it's a Bluecurl watching list. So if you all of a sudden have a great urge to go out and find some Bluecurls, here are some great parks to go to. If you're looking for a good diversity of Bluecurls, the following parks have 3 entities present, or could possibly have 3 entities present. So Jonathan Dickinson State Park has floridanum, pine flatwoods, and Hobe Mountain Bluecurls. Citrus Wildlife Management Area has setaceum, Dichotomum sensu stricto, and the Brooksville Ridge entity. And then the next 2, I have found 2 of the species listed, but given the environment, it's very likely that the 3rd, which is restricted in both cases, also occurs there. So in Mike Rose Old Head Branch State Park, I have found setaceum and Subretessence sensu stricto, but not Dichotomum, but Dichotomum is probably there. Bailey Mine Tract of Ghost State Forest has Dichotomum sensu stricto and the Brooksville Ridge entity, but setaceum probably also there given the environment. Most parks in the Panhandle that have setaceum also have Dichotomum, and sometimes they even grow really close to each other. For example, in Blackwater River State Forest, I found this, where on the left, we have Dichotomum sensu stricto, and on the right, we have setaceum growing. I actually measured that. I think that was 5 centimeters apart. So these things do co-occur, and they do pretty obviously maintain their morphological differences. And this is one of the hallmarks of quote unquote true species. So obviously there is something that is keeping these 2 species from coming together and making kind of intermediate morphological plants. If you're looking for just lots and lots of Bluecurls, the best places to go are Ralphie Simmons State Forest if you want Dichotomum sensu stricto. Again, along that power line cut, there are just thousands of it, at least the last time I went. And there are also tons of other native wildflowers that bloom about the same time. It's just a gorgeous, gorgeous piece of land. The floridanum entity in most of the larger coastal parks, there it's just everywhere. It's everywhere. Subretessence sensu stricto, the largest population that I was able to find of it was in Mike Rose Old Head Branch State Park. That's at the northernmost end of its range. A lot of the other places where I found it, they were kind of small populations that were kind of in amongst scrub and very hard to find. The pine flatwoods entity, there's tons of it at Split Oak Forest, and there's also tons of it at Jonathan Dickinson State Park. Those are the 2 largest populations that I'm aware of. The Brooksville Ridge entity is all over Citrus Wildlife Management Area, and the Hobe Mountain Bluecurls Sea Branch Preserve State Park by far has the largest population of that one. So in conclusion, I'd like to thank a lot of people. First, my primary field assistant, AKA Dad. So all of these pictures that I have taken, a large portion of me getting there was my dad being kind enough to drive me and help me find them for 2 summers, 2017 and 2018. So huge help, huge shout out to Dad. Thank you, Dad. Edwin Bridges and Steve Orzel were also instrumental in getting me access to some places like the Avon Park Air Force Range, and also lots of sage wisdom coming from those 2. The Florida Flora and Ecosystematics and iNaturalist groups, hugely helpful, because basically they're like, hey, I found this Trichostema, and I can be like, cool, and I drive to it, and I don't have to search hours and hours to actually find what I'm looking for. I have folks who know where the plants are and are actually able to get me to them. All of the parks that allowed me to actually come and take pictures and take specimens, there are too many to list. I went to 132 alone just in Florida. But they have come primarily from the 4 institutions represented on the right. And of course, our lovely hosts today, the Florida Native Plant Society. Thank you so much. Thank you all for listening. And I will now happily take questions. Thank you.
Volume for them. Okay, so I told Kevin it was a great presentation. Yep, and I was going to say that you're get ready for another flood of Trichostema observation from Split Oak, because I'm just about to apply for the permit for our fall bio blitz.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah, so, and people love them, so lots of photos of, and I'll make sure that they take stem hair photos and everything.
Okay.
Okay, Suzanne Kennedy asks, does this Trichostema pine flatwoods occur in Merritt Island anywhere naturally?
In where?
Merritt Island.
Merritt Island. So I'm not aware of it occurring in Merritt Island. The floridanum entity is primarily the thing that occurs in Merritt Island. It's possible that it might occur in some of the scrubbier places of Merritt Island, but I have not seen any observations, nor have I found it there. But given that Merritt Island does have a lot of kind of scrubby areas, I would imagine that it has the potential to be there.
So go look. Is that a suggestion?
Yeah, so go look.
Okay.
You'll probably find, if you're looking, you'll probably find at least floridanum in the shellier spots, because floridanum is all over Merritt Island.
Awesome. And I think probably people really would like to talk about their own Bluecurls, right? Since Bluecurls has been in the, Florida plant trade for 10, 15 years now. And
yes.
So both Suzanne Kennedy and Mary Keim would like to know, how do they know what species they have? Suzanne says that, let's see, let me scroll up to hers. She says she got hers at maybe Maple Street Natives or Carrie's Nature Wise at an FMPS plant sale maybe 10 years ago, but she doesn't remember exactly which nursery. And she does have photos, if you're curious.
Well, if she has photos, I can do my best. But what I found is that whatever Trichostema was chosen, I think the original selection was of that big bushy variety because of how large the plant gets and with how much bigger the flowers are compared to the other ones. So that's the one, the big bushy one is the one that I have most often seen in the nursery trait in Florida. But I do not know about individual nurseries specifically. But I have seen the big bushy Bluecurls planted from, it's planted at the Sanibel Captiva Conservation Foundation, their native plant garden. It's there. It's in Gamble Rogers. People planted it at Lake Louisa State Park. It has been spread far and wide across Florida by the nursery trade. But in order for me to be entirely certain, I would need to see your plants. But generally, if it is a very, very large bushy plant with really big leaves and really big flowers, it's probably the big bushy one.
Right. So big and bushy in your
yeah
big and bushy. Okay. So and Mary Keim was saying, how do you know if you have two different varieties of one species or two different species in your yard?
So the big thing here is that right now we've got only 3 named species. So Dichotomum, Subretessence, or Trichostema. So in the scientific literature, none of those have varieties, and so you have one of those 3 species. With the entities that I'm investigating, what I'm really looking at is, okay, are the different entities morphologically different from each other? And do they form kind of these good groups that are morphologically similar? So in all plants, there is some variation, particularly in leaf size. And that actually led Wonderland in 1982 to say that Trichostema dichotomum and Trichostema subretessence are the same species, because there was so much of this messiness and overlap in leaf sizes in Florida that he was just like, I guess it's just one species that's just very, very plastic. But what I've been doing is I have taken almost 1,000 specimens and done morphological work and taken a lot of ecological data as well. And they do kind of parse out into the entities that I presented today. So also depending on where you are, the different entities, especially in the Subretessence group, do not co-occur with each other. They are fairly either geographically or ecologically isolated from each other. The only exception to that is in Jonathan Dickinson State Park. The pine flatwoods and the scrub in that park are very close together. So you have the Hobe Mountain and the pine flatwoods entity very close together in that park. Dichotomum and setaceum occur a lot together. But again, some of the dichotomum segregates, so the big and bushy and the floridanum, have specific ecological requirements that kind of keep them separated from dichotomum in the strict sense. And so if you have plants in your yard that you're wondering what they are, in the majority of cases, if they all look pretty similar and maybe just have some variation in leaf size or leaf shape, you're probably just looking at natural variation within a species, as opposed to different varieties or subspecies of a single species.
Have you observed hybridization in this species?
I have not. I've not really observed anything that I would comfortably call a hybrid, even in places where they come into close contact, particularly with the dichotomum entities. The dichotomum entities, given that dichotomum itself is a generalist, it will co-occur or be very, very close to floridanum and some of the big bushy things, but I've not seen anything that looks intermediate between the two in the intermediate ecological zones. They seem to be pretty separate, despite the fact that, you know, they're all bee pollinated. And so you would think that, you know, if they grew close enough to each other, there would be just hybrids all over the place. But that really doesn't seem to be the case.
Mary Kime requests that you repeat what SS means.
Oh, sensu stricto, so in the strict sense. So right now in the scientific community, Trichostema dichotomum as a species includes floridanum and the big bushy Bluecurls, and all of those variations that I have lumped into these entities. The species concept of dichotomum includes all of that under one species. So when I say in the strict sense, I'm talking about a very specific group of Trichostema dichotomum that, if the other entities were to be made into their own species, those entities would get different names as being different from dichotomum. And then the dichotomum, sensu stricto, would remain dichotomum.
Right. So if I have a bunch of iNaturalist observations of Trichostema, and then, you know, I have some as dichotomum that are definitely dichotomum, right? So sensu stricto dichotomum. Then there's other stuff that I have, you know, identified as dichotomum, but it's not. And then you get your papers published, and then these become new species. Then we add them on iNaturalist. Then those get reclassified.
Yes.
So those
but the dichotomum sensu stricto will stay dichotomum.
So these are not sensu stricto. These other ones, 2 or 3.
Yeah.
Okay. Awesome. June Allen asks, do any of them have purple stems?
Do any of them have purple stems? I wouldn't necessarily call it purple. So being mints and having blue flowers, these plants produce a lot of pigmentation using anthocyanins. So anthocyanins can create, depending upon how they're made, a blue color to a red color. And in the stems of Trichostema, I'd say the closest thing to purple would be like a really dark maroon I've seen. And you can kind of see that coloration here in this middle. I don't know.
You stop sharing. You stop sharing.
Oh, okay.
So people can
but the a lot of the Subretessence entities will get a lot of anthocyanins in their stems, and in some of their calyxes. And again, I wouldn't call it purple. I would call it kind of a really dark maroon.
So to her credit, she said purplish, and I said purple.
Purplish. Yes.
She said purplish.
Yes. They do get purplish because they and the leaves, when the leaves get older, will get purplish because of those anthocyanins.
Yep. Okay. Let's see. One last thing. Suzanne asks, what kind of soil does the pine flatwoods entity need?
Sand.
So we're not talking about like with a spodic horizon or something. Will it, if it's too, or is that okay?
So it isn't particularly picky about the kind of substrate you have, but rather how well drained the substrate is. I am not an expert in any sense in terms of all of the specific terms for the different types of soils. I just know that it prefers sandy soils that are well drained. So if you've got sandy soil, but they're underlaid with something that's going to hold a lot of water and make like a pond, it's not going to like that. It likes its feet a little dry.
Okay. All right. I think that is all the questions in the chat. Thank you again. I mean, incredible. Great work.
Thank you.
Fantastic.
It was a pleasure.
Same here. All right. I hope you have a fantastic Friday and long weekend. And bye to everyone else who's watching.